this priest had been in a confessional all afternoon. He's getting kind of tired, kind of exasperated. And this gentleman comes in and says, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I work at a lumber yard and I have stolen some wood from my employer." And the priest says, "Well, how much wood?" He said, "A lot." "Well," the priest says, "is it enough to build a doghouse?" He says, "Well, yes." "Is it enough to build a garage?" "Well, yes." "Is it enough to build a ranch house?" "Well, yes." And the priest says, "Okay, I get the picture. Do you know what a novena is?" He said, "Father, if you give me the plans, I'll supply the lumber." So this afternoon we're going to have a talk from Chris Ferrara and Father Buckley. Chris is first. Christopher Ferrara is he's increasingly concerned about the alarming direction of the current pontificate. It appears increasingly evident that we have not been given the whole truth about the Third Secret of Fatima and the enigmatic bishop dressed in white. Christopher Ferrara is President and Chief Counsel for the American Catholic Lawyers Association. He is a prolific writer for Catholic magazines and periodicals. He is active in the pro-life movement, and he has written the book, The Great Facade, The Regime of Novelty in the Catholic Church from Vatican II to the Francis Revolution, and also Liberty, the God That Failed. So please, I ask you to welcome Christopher Ferrara.
Thank you, Quincy. I see the microphone is according to my specifications. Let me begin by remarking on something that Father Ilo said during his talk about how this is not our home. We need to keep that in mind. We are in the wayfaring state. Our home is in heaven or hell, depending upon how we end our lives. And the four last things are something we can lose sight of. And we can lose sight of the destiny that each of us has, the eternal destiny, if we become too wrapped up in these political things. It can make us bitter. But let us be bitter for a while. But I'm serious about that. We can't, but although this is not our home, and although our destiny is eternal, this is the wayfaring state, and what we do in this state will determine our destiny. And since ours is not a me and Jesus religion, we have to be concerned about the common good and the fate of others in this wayfaring state. And the wayfaring state is going to be determined by the kind of polity we live in. So these are questions of paramount importance. And my topic is about developments within the body politic. And the question is, what do Brexit, the election of Donald J. Trump, and the Roman Catholic Traditionalist movement have in common? And I think the answer is fairly obvious. They all are arising as a defense in one form or another against the late stages of the advance of the spirit of the age in church and state. Father Ilo spoke of fear as a motivating factor. Fear on the right, certainly. People realized, if only instinctively, that they could lose the country if that woman got elected. And they were motivated to come out and vote as they have never been motivated before. And fear on the left. Fear on the left because the forces that have controlled our destiny thus far fear a potential exorcism from the body politic. And they're reacting with demoniacal fury to that prospect. We've never seen anything like it in the press or in the political establishment in opposition to a Republican candidate actually succeeding in being elected president. Now, as I say, this is a problem in church and state. Movements have arisen in church and state, motivated by fear that things have gone too far. Speaking of the situation in the church, Dietrich von Hildebrand said back in the 1970s, and this is a famous quote, but I never tire of repeating it because it's so true and so prophetic. The poison of our epoch, he said, is slowly seeping into the church herself, and many have failed to see the apocalyptic decline of our time. the apocalyptic decline of our time. Now, what is the poison of our epoch? I think it can be summarized in a single phrase. It is the total emancipation of the body politic from the influence of the Catholic Church. That's all it comes down to. Now, in his landmark encyclical, Immortale Dei, on the Christian Constitution of States, Pope Leo talked about precisely that, this process of emancipation. And he enunciated 3 stages in the process. And I'll quote from that encyclical because it's worth reading verbatim. He spoke, first of all, of that harmful and deplorable passion for innovation which was aroused in the 16th century, which threw all into confusion the Christian religion. And next, he said, by natural sequence, invaded the precincts of philosophy, whence it spread amongst all classes of society. From this source, as from a fountainhead, burst forth all those later tenets of unbridled license, which in the midst of the terrible upheavals of the last century were wildly conceived and boldly proclaimed as the principles and foundation of that new conception of law, which was not merely previously unknown, but was at variance on many points with not only the Christian, but even the natural law. So these are the 3 stages he's talking about. First, confusion in religion. And here, I think in terms of a plague, a religious plague, and patient zero in the plague is, of course, Martin Luther. And his thinking, his rebellion against the church fulminated throughout the empire and resulted in the destruction of what was once Christendom. But even though the Catholic confessional state persisted after Luther's revolt in one form or another, it was not until the revolt in philosophy that the link between Christianity and the operations of the state was definitively broken. And I'm talking, first of all, about the founders of political modernity, Locke and Hobbes. It has been said about Locke that he is the confused man's Hobbes. He said ambiguously, he paved with the road of golden ambiguity, the things that Hobbes was saying. But they were both, at their essence, nominalists and positivists. And Locke, in particular, very skillfully conducted a war on being itself by calling into question the whole idea of an orderly and hierarchical universe of divinely ordained substances, unities of matter and form. And once you overthrow that conception of things, in which everything must be the way God has ordained it to be, all kinds of revolutionary possibilities come into view. And this is why Voltaire hailed Locke as the great pioneer of the dissolution of the Aristotelian Thomistic system, which allowed all of thought to be dissolved into various revolutionary currents. But then the practice of revolution, the 3rd stage that Leo talked about, he referred to the upheavals of the previous century, the age of democratic revolution, putting into practice the revolution in philosophy and religion in the first officially secular state, the United States of America, in 1776. And from there, the revolutionary spirit spread to France, throughout Europe, throughout Latin America, and the world, giving us what Leo XIII succinctly denounced, as I quoted a moment ago, that new conception of law, previously unknown, that's at variance not only with the Christian law, but with the natural law. And what does he mean by that? He tells us. And what he tells us is a state of affairs that we think today is our conservative inheritance. We've been taught to believe that this is conservatism. Here's what he says about this unknown conception of law: that all are equal in the control of their life, that each one is so far his own master as to be in no sense under the rule of any other individual, that each is free to think on every subject just as he may choose, and to do whatever he may like to do, that no man has any right to rule over other men, that the judgment of each one's conscience is independent of all law, that the most unrestrained opinions may be openly expressed as to the practice or omission of divine worship, and that everyone has unbounded license to think whatever he chooses and to publish abroad whatever he thinks. In other words, freedom from all authority, above all the authority of the Catholic Church, and freedom for error. And the result, paradoxically, is now the tyranny of authority, because authority is now unbound by the restraints of the revealed religion. And also the loss of all freedom for truth, which is now dominated by unrestrained error. And we see this, of course, in the American and world political scene. We've reached the point where now those in public life have to tiptoe around even something so absurd as whether boys should be allowed to use the girls' bathroom. They have to be defensive and apologetic about opposing this insanity. I just saw a show the other night. Did you see Tucker Carlson debating this proponent of boys in the girls' bathroom and vice versa? He said, well, suppose I want to say I'm black and I want a scholarship because I'm black. If sexuality is what I declare it to be, if I'm a male because I say I'm a male, or a female because I say I'm a female, despite my biological makeup, why can't I say I'm black? Why can't I say I'm a woman and demand a lady scholarship? The man had no answer because it's utter nonsense. And yet we've reached the point in the body politic where the most insane opinions are now to be accepted as the gospel truth. And anyone who opposes this insanity is considered intolerant. This is just as Leo predicted. The only thing under persecution today is the truth. Now, Hildebrand saw nearly half a century ago that the church was being invaded by the poison of our epoch, this spirit of the age that I've sketched for you very quickly. But at this point, we can no longer say it is seeping into the church. It has thoroughly permeated the church. It has weakened the entire mystical body of Christ. Of course, there are many good priests and even some good bishops remaining. But the body as a whole has been debilitated because this seepage has become a permeation of the church by the spirit of the age. The church's human element obviously no longer offers opposition to the poison of our epoch, but has imbibed so much of it that it is paralyzed in terms of social action. There are two Latin phrases, ad infra and ad extra. Ad infra, the church still has her sacraments. It's possible to be absolved. It's possible to save your soul. That has not changed, although it's harder to find these things. But ad extra, there's been a total conversion of the church to the spirit of the world in her engagement with political society. The Church Militant is de facto defunct. And over the past 50 years, Rome itself seems now determined to bar any return to civilizational sanity. In 1870, Pius IX held up the white flag of surrender to Mazzini and Garibaldi. But in 1962 and thereafter, the church raised a white flag of surrender to the zeitgeist itself. And while paralyzed in her external mission, the church is also the victim of internal poisoning. Above all, of course, the liturgical reforms, designed to appeal above all to Protestants, who have, incredibly enough, these reforms, done more than Luther himself ever dreamed of in his attempt to destroy the Mass. Klaus Gammer said in his work on the so-called reform of the Roman liturgy that what the reformers did in the Catholic Church after the Council with the new Mass, and I quote, is much more radical than any liturgical changes introduced by Luther. This is Klaus Gammer writing with the approval of the future Pope Benedict XVI. He goes on to say that it was more radical than what Luther proposed as far as the rite was concerned, the reorganization of our own liturgy. Above all, the fundamental changes that were made in the liturgy of the Mass. The scholar of European history, Ewan Cameron, calls this an unprecedented liturgical rupture, what Luther did when it happened in the German states and the free cities in the 1520s and the 1530s. But what has happened to the Catholic Church, inflicted upon itself by her own leadership, is even more radical than what Luther succeeded in doing. Now, Luther knew that if he wanted to overthrow the influence of the church over political society, if he wanted to break the power of the papacy, not only over the papal states, but over all of Christendom, he had to do away with the liturgical civilization that underlay the mystical body of Christ, when at the time it was coextensive with the body politic. He knew he had to destroy liturgical unity, and he succeeded. And now the church has succeeded in furthering that destruction within her own precincts. At the same time, since the Council, ecumenism and dialogue have replaced opposition to the errors of Protestantism and the necessity of the return to the one true church for Christian unity with a kind of pan-denominational and even a pan-religious indifferentism that denies in practice the identity of the mystical body with the Roman Catholic Church. And even as the various Protestant sects descend into states of moral and doctrinal decrepitude, Protestants are now unquestionably accepted as brothers and sisters in Christ. Catholic churchmen hail this growing unity that they imagine to exist between Catholics and Protestants. But they don't seem to notice that to the extent that there is growing unity, it consists entirely in the Protestantization of Catholics, beginning with the hierarchy. So with liturgical unity shattered by a vernacular rite that no longer conveys mimetically what it provides sacramentally, there has been a consequent loss of grace even within the mystical body itself because of the liturgical destruction. Now, if that claim sounds extreme to you, listen again to what Klaus Gamber says, and I quote from the Reform of the Roman Liturgy. The real destruction of the traditional Mass, of the traditional Roman rite with a history of more than 1,000 years, is the wholesale destruction of the faith on which it was based. A faith that had been the source of our piety and our courage to bear witness to Christ and his church, the inspiration of countless Catholics over many centuries, end quote. And let us face it, today the majority of Catholics are now more or less de facto Protestants. Indeed, quite liberal Protestants, whose practice and views on contraception, abortion, divorce, gay marriage are now more liberal than even the views of the more conservative evangelical Protestants, with whom, sad to say, we have more in common than we do with many of our fellow Catholics. I know many of these people in Richmond, Virginia. They're appalled at how liberal the Catholic Church has become. And they're right to be appalled. Now, even Luther, who likened contraception to sodomy, would view with amazed incomprehension the liberal wreck that is most of the human element of the Catholic Church today. John Paul II called it silent apostasy, although he did virtually nothing about it. But now we have a pope who sounds for all the world like Luther, who continually mocks the Orthodox, coddles the heterodox, panders to sexual sins, ridicules the traditional Mass as, quote, a kind of fashion, describes the dogma of transubstantiation as a mere interpretation, informs Protestants that all who are baptized belong to the same Church of Christ, no matter what heresies they profess, what sins they condone, and publicly informs a Lutheran woman, as we all saw, in a Lutheran church, during ceremonies in which he participated, that it is a matter to be decided between her and the Lord whether she should receive Holy Communion in a Catholic church along with her Catholic husband, which, by the way, she later went and did. And now the same Pope has traveled to Sweden to honor precisely Luther, the greatest heresiarch of all time. And that abomination took place on October 31st, 2016, in which Francis participated in a liturgy that included a woman in a bishop's costume who thinks that she is the Lutheran primate of Sweden. And the liturgy featured this common prayer. The ecumenical journey enables Lutherans and Catholics to appreciate together Martin Luther's insight into and spiritual experience of the gospel of the righteousness of God, which is also God's mercy. Thanks be to you, O God, for the many guiding theological and spiritual insights that we have all received through the Reformation. So, to sum up, the human element of the Church has undergone a thoroughgoing Protestant Reformation over the past 50 years. An irony of ironies, Lutheranism, having failed catastrophically as a religion, has achieved its greatest victory over the Church as an ideology. And if Luther is in a place where laughter is possible, he's laughing now, intermittently with his tormented screams. Now, if the salt loses its savor, it will be trampled underfoot. But today the Church endures the spectacle of a pope and a hierarchy that seems to invite the trampling. With the suave assurance of an Argentinian ideologue, the current Roman pontiff declared to the world, and I quote, "States must be secular. Confessional states end badly. That goes against the grain of history." But the man from Argentina seems not to have noticed that the grain of history is a trail of blood beginning at the feet of the man whose rebellion against God he himself commemorated in Sweden, Martin Luther. The Catholic confessional state did not simply end badly, it was ended badly by wave after wave of civic zombies who contracted their disease from patient zero or his descendants. The rise of Protestantism is the zombie apocalypse that has destroyed a once Christian civilization. And today we behold the spectacle of the Catholic zombies, who are worse than the Protestants, and whom Protestants find appalling on account of their liberalism, including, sad to say, members of the hierarchy, such as a certain bishop down in San Diego, who has come out in favor of communion for the divorced and remarried, and communion for practicing homosexual couples. So, that's bad enough. But in recent days, within the last year, this crisis, as bad as it is, has reached a whole new level. I never thought it possible. Doctrine itself is now under attack at the highest levels of the church. And I'm talking about, of course, the promulgation of Amoris Laetitia and its aftermath. This comes at the end of some 4 years of papal denunciations of Orthodox Catholics as pharisaical, rigorous, legalists, and so forth. We are now at the point where the teaching of John Paul II and Benedict XVI is being overthrown, and with them, the entire tradition of the church on the negative precepts of the natural law. First and foremost, thou shalt not commit adultery. In Amoris Laetitia, we read about morality as an objective ideal, not a negative precept of the natural law that has no exceptions, but an objective ideal. We read about discernment. One is now to discern whether he is called upon to follow this lofty, high ideal, as Bishop Barron recently called it in one of his video commentaries. The commandments are now ideals. The 10 commandments have become the 10 ideals. Of course, if you ask them whether thou shalt not kill is an objective ideal, they back away from that. This essentially seems to be a license for the commission of sins against the 6th commandment. Thou shalt not commit adultery has been revised to read, thou shalt strive not to commit adultery. And if you can't reach the objective ideal, the church will accompany you. Now, Francesco Coco Palmiero, somehow I think that name is appropriate, Coco Palmieri. He's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. President of the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts, has just come out with a book on where all of this is happening, Chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, which introduces, let us face it, a kind of attenuated situation ethics into the church, where morality, the 6th commandment in particular, is reduced to an objective ideal, and then depending upon the complexities of one's limits, to quote from Amoris Laetitia, one is expected to adhere to that or not to adhere to that. It depends upon your situation. In paragraph 303 of Amoris Laetitia says that someone in his complex circumstances might decide that the way he's behaving now in an irregular union is what for now is the best response he can give to God, and he can be morally certain that God accepts this. So Francesco Coco Palmiero, the president of the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts, construing Chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, and this concept of discernment in particular, now says, and I quote, the divorced and remarried de facto couples, those cohabiting, are certainly not models of unions in sync with Catholic doctrine, but the church cannot look the other way. Therefore, the sacraments of reconciliation and communion must be given even to those so-called wounded families, and even to however many who, despite living in situations not in line with traditional matrimonial canons, express the sincere desire to approach the sacraments after an appropriate period of discernment, whatever that means. It's essentially the Protestant principle of private judgment. I discern that I need not end my irregular relationship. I discern that I may receive Holy Communion because, as the bishops of Malta say, I am at peace with God. So I will continue my adulterous relations with my second wife, perhaps even my third wife, after an appropriate period of discernment. So he concludes, yes, therefore, to admission to the sacraments of those who, despite living in irregular situations, sincerely ask for admission into the fullness of ecclesial life. How is this not apocalyptic? That we have a Vatican prelate, the head of the Pontifical Council for the interpretation of legislative texts, seriously proposing this, which is essentially the destruction of the Sixth Commandment in practice. It's even worse. Doctrine itself is now going to be swallowed Pac-Man-like by this idea of discernment. The little Pac-Man of discernment is coming for doctrine. So we hear from the new head of the Jesuits, Arturo Abascal, who was very close to Francis, the following. Over the last century of the Church, there has been a great blossoming of studies that seek to understand exactly what Jesus meant to say. That is not relativism. Oh no, that's not relativism. But attests that the word is relative. He just said it's not relativism, and then he said that the word is relative. This is how the modernist operates. He affirms what he denies, and then he denies what he affirms. The gospel is written by human beings. It is accepted by the church, which is made up of human persons. So it is true that no one can change the words of Jesus, but one must know what it was. We don't change his words, we just don't know what they mean. We have to determine what they mean. Now, Father Ilo spoke of an attack on the family as crucial to the problem that faces us today. The reason we have isolated individuals, powerless before the omnipotent state. But who knew that the attack on the family would come even from within the church? Who knew that this attack would extend to the very idea of doctrine itself as fixed and immutable revealed truth? Because Abascal goes on to say that discernment must be applied to all of doctrine. Here's what his questioner, his rather incredulous questioner, asks him. Is it also possible to question the statement in Matthew 19:3-6? What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder? And Abascal's answer, I go along with what Pope Francis says. One does not bring it into doubt, one brings it into discernment. And the questioner says, incredulously, but discernment is evaluation. It is choosing among different options. There was no longer an obligation to follow just one interpretation. The answer, in typical modernist style, oh no, the obligation is still there, but to follow the result of discernment. So then the upshot of it is, and I'm quoting Abascal, the church has developed over the centuries. It is not a piece of reinforced concrete. It was born, it has learned, it has changed. Doctrine is a word I don't like very much. It brings with it the image of the hardness of stone. Instead, the human reality is much more nuanced. It is never black or white. It is in continual development. End quote. And hasn't Francis said the same thing? Doctrine is the flesh of Jesus, which changes. This is exactly what Abascal is saying. And then at the end, Abascal sums it all up, leaving us with no doubt of where he's going with this, and where the upper hierarchy is going with this, particularly within the Vatican apparatus. The questioner, again, apparently incredulous, says, I seem to understand that for you there is a priority for the practice of the discernment of doctrine. Yes, but doctrine is part of discernment. True discernment cannot dispense with doctrine. Question, but it can reach conclusions different from doctrine. Answer, that is so, because doctrine does not replace discernment, nor does it replace the Holy Spirit. End quote. All of doctrine is now subsumed by the latest neologism in the post-conciliar church, which goes along with dialogue, ecumenism, the new evangelization, and so forth. Discernment. Discernment replaces doctrine. We now discern what the truth is for each of us. So the church has been penetrated not only by the poison of our epic and moral and doctrinal terms, but also in doctrinal terms, but also in political terms. Because the effect of all of this is going to be the neutralization of the church in political action. So has anyone noticed, I'm sure you have, the strange congruence between the unprecedented political agenda of the current Roman pontiff and that of the secular imperium that rules the world, with the unexpected exception of Donald Trump and the White House staff, who are now under attack from all sides. And I mean, of course, open borders, climate change, wealth redistribution, the elimination of poverty, and so forth. This is the Franciscan agenda. It is also the agenda of the Obama/United Nations world hegemon. And so all in all, to the extent humanly possible, the church seems to be reaching a kind of state of equilibrium with the outside world. It's like a warm room, assuming the outdoor temperature when you open the windows. Eventually an equilibrium is achieved. And wouldn't you know it, Coco Palmerio offers a metaphor in which he confirms what I've just said. He said, regarding the novelties that we've seen during this pontificate, and I'm quoting him, there's always opposition. When there's something new, those who think one way have a negative reaction. If you live in a room with stuffy air and you open the window, some will appreciate the freshness of the new air. Others will want the window closed because the new air is cold. The air is his doctrine, is pure, without doubt very good. These novelties generate a reaction like the one to cold air. That's just, to me, that's just staggering. We now have this idea of the Gnostic seer as Pope. His doctrine, Coco Palmerio tells us, is pure and good. What do you mean, his doctrine? He's talking about novelties. When strictly speaking, what the church has laid down in her infallible magisterium over the centuries, either by an extraordinary definition or through the constant teaching of the ordinary magisterium, is not subject to novelties. The church has no power to announce novelties in doctrine. There can only be development, a further understanding, a deepening of what we know about the revealed truth. But he's talking specifically about doctrinal novelties and the slap in the face that we get when the cold air of these novelties rushes into the room. So the warmth of the divine light of truth is being replaced by the cold air of the ideas of Jose Mario Bergoglio. They are saying it. I'm not deducing this. I'm not inferring it. I'm not finding implications and then making too much of them. They're openly saying it. Now, we've had popes in the past who posed a problem along the lines of saying things that were heterodox. Honorius, for example, Honorius I was condemned for an ecumenical council, by an ecumenical council, and those condemnations were confirmed by his successor pope because he lent credence to the monothelite heresy, that there's only one will in Christ, the divine will. John the 22nd insisted again and again from the pulpit and wrote a treatise on the idea that the blessed departed will not see God until the end of time. He was denounced for that. He retracted his opinion on his deathbed. So we've reached in the church, as in the world, an unprecedented level of crisis, which brings us to what the three movements have in common. There's the element of fear, that things have gone too far. Something has to be done, which brings me to the conclusion. What do Brexit, the election of Trump, and Traditionalists and the Traditionalist movement have in common? The awareness that the process of surrender to the spirit of the age has gone too far, that we must pull back from the abyss, that we must restore what has been taken from us, that there must be a return to sanity. Where Brexit is concerned, the people of Britain said we have to recover our sovereignty from the tyranny of the EU dictatorship of open borders and political correctness. Trumpism is the assertion of American sovereignty, making America great again by withdrawing from the globalist New World Order and putting America first, but not just in terms of political sovereignty, wealth and prestige, but also in moral and spiritual terms. We see some very encouraging signs, among which is the number of Catholics with which he has surrounded himself. So, however imperfectly this can be realized in America's Protestant milieu, we see some encouraging signs in that regard. And then there's the Traditionalist movement. We must make the church great again, not in the sense that we can do so by our human effort, but rather in the sense that we must restore the neglected treasures of the faith so that the church's supernatural greatness can be made visible once again. And here again, I do not exaggerate. This is what Cardinal Ratzinger said. But if in the liturgy the communion of faith no longer appears, nor the universal unity of the church and of her history, nor the mystery of the living Christ, where is it that the church still appears in her spiritual substance? Father Illo spoke of right worship as being absolutely integral to this movement to take back our country and restore what St. Augustine called the tranquility of order in our society. Not just logistical order, the external appearance of order, but the internal order of souls who live in harmony with the divine plan. Without right worship, this is not going to be possible. But the church has to be great again also in human terms, in terms of her ability to go out with courage to once again be a force for the renewal of social order through the influence of the church militant over the body politic. Romano Amerio put it this way in his great work, Iota Uno, and I quote him: "Faith in Providence thus proclaims the possibility that the world might rise and be healed by a metanoia which it cannot initiate, but which it is capable of accepting once it is offered. The church must make that offer again, so that the members of the body politic can once again become coextensive with the mystical body." But as Steve O'Brien was pointing out in his talk, the church has never quite understood this imperative in her history in America. It's been too often a policy of going along to get along. But it is only when the church begins that work of bringing the body politic into conformity with the mystical body of Christ that America will become truly great again. Trumpism is not enough. As good as it is, it's only a first step, a step back from the abyss of political modernity. G.K. Chesterton said that the modern world with its modern movements is living on its Catholic capital. It is using up the truths that remain to it out of the old treasury of Christendom. That capital has been exhausted, or all but exhausted. Trump is drawing on a few bits and pieces of it. But what he's offering is a kind of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It's positive because it buys us time for a reorganization, but it is still a form of bankruptcy, an attempt to rescue a morally and spiritually bankrupt system from the end result of that bankruptcy, which is total collapse. And you can think of his Catholic assistants as as bankruptcy trustees. They're hoping to preside over this process of buying us time, attempting a reorganization. But the reorganization will ultimately fail, and I think Father Ilo suggested that in his talk, unless that reorganization results in something like a true Christian commonwealth. No one understood this better than Orestes Brownson, the late 19th century convert to Catholicism. He understood it way back when, before it was even apparent to many Catholics. And he said it this way: "Where the people of God are Catholic and submissive to the law of God as declared and applied by the Vicar of Christ and Supreme Pastor of the Church, democracy may be a good form of government. But," he went on to say, "combined with Protestantism or infidelity in the people, its inevitable tendency is to lower the standard of morality, to enfeeble intellect, to abase character, and to retard civilization, as even our short American experience amply proves. Our republic may have had a material expansion and growth, but every observing and reflecting American whose memory goes back as mine does over 50 years sees that in all else it is tending downward and is on the declivity to utter barbarism." Now, the third and last stage of Protestantism, said Brownson, is individualism. He wrote that in 1845. Father Ilo spoke of the plight of the isolated individual. That is the Protestant end stage. It's me and Jesus, or me and my conception of Jesus, which I have discerned to be the way that the Lord wants me to walk, including my second or third marriage. Now, Brownson wrote of an old difficulty about the problem of Protestantism as a possible matrix for the rebuilding of Christian social order. And the old difficulty is that Protestantism, of course, is a majoritarian religion. Protestantism, he argued, is not and cannot be the religion to sustain democracy, because like democracy itself, it is subject to the control of the people and must command and teach what they say, and of course must follow instead of controlling their passions, interests, and caprices. And so the Protestant religion has declined in tandem with the body politic that embraced it. And the end result, we now see, is nothing less than a return to paganism. Don Juan Donoso Cortez, the great Catholic revolutionary of the 1850s, counter-revolutionary of the 1850s, wrote about it this way. He said, "When Catholic societies prevaricate and fall, it happens that paganism immediately gains a foothold in them, and we behold ideas, customs, and institutions, and the entire society relapsing into paganism. The only definitive rescue from the abyss at the end of the declivity that Brownson talked about is the reintegration of the body politic with the mystical body and the reconstruction of the universal liturgical polity that Luther and his descendants destroyed, including those who followed in his path within the church after the Second Vatican Council. The Anglican scholar John Milbank has put it this way: only a global liturgical polity can save us now from literal violence. An Anglican sees this. He's nice enough to give my book a good review. That's why I quote it. And another thing I'd like to note and quote for you, because a lot of people are waking up. It isn't just the traditionalist movement anymore. Many people in the mainstream are realizing things have gone too far during this pontificate, and they are waking up and saying things that we have been saying for well nigh 50 years. And I give you as an example, David Carlin, writing in First Things only a few days ago. I'm an old man, old enough to have vivid memories of what American Catholicism was prior to the end of Vatican II. But we're asked to give a very short summary of the differences between pre-V2 and post-V2 versions of American Catholicism. I would say the former was a thick religion, while the latter is a thin religion. And I would add that thick religions are hard, while thin religions are easy. So pre-V2 Catholicism was thick and hard, while present-day American Catholicism is thin and easy. But unless it once again becomes something like the old thick religion, American Catholicism will continue to shrink and shrink and shrink. It will become less and less important in American life. A religion that was once on the verge of becoming the single most important religious factor in our national life will become little more than a hole-in-the-corner religion. It will never be able to flourish if it continues to be what it is now, a thin and easy religion. First Things said this, not The Remnant, not Catholic Family News, non-EO, but a mainstream Catholic publication. So what finally do Brexit, Trumpism, and the traditionalist movement have in common? They are all in need of one and the same thing to achieve their ultimate goals. They are all in need of a Catholic revival. Only when grace is restored to the body politic, through the social action of the church and the reconversion of the Western world, will all three movements, European populism, American populism, and Catholic traditionalism, working together, bring about a saving integration in the undivided whole that was once Christendom and can be again. And that, the media seem to sense, the demonic left seems to sense, is what that sneaky Steve Bannon is all about. With all of his checkered past, and Donald Trump, who hired him with all of his checkered past, that's what they're really all about, isn't it now? Bringing back theocratic elements, Catholic elements. Look at all those Catholics surrounding Trump. Look at Father Scalia after the nomination of Neil Gorsuch in the White House, praying with Trump and Pence. So that seems to be what Bannon has in mind if we can judge by his speech at the Vatican, where he talks about what I've been talking about, a twofold crisis in the church and in political society, showing how the two things go together. Now this great metanoia will happen sooner or later, just as has happened before in our civilization. The world, however, may be a very different place when that day comes. Perhaps it will be a world very much like Europe during the barbarian invasions. Alistair MacIntyre put it this way: and if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we are not entirely without grounds for hope. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing us for quite some time. And it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We are waiting not for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict. Will we see the beginning of this revival in 2017, the centenary of the Fatima apparitions, which just so happens to coincide with the beginning of the Trump administration? We must pray that it will be so. Thank you. I'm sure there are no questions, and then I may take my leave. Right? Okay. Good, nothing, okay.
Thank you, Chris.